Everyone's software is good enough. Software used to be the weapon. Now it's just a tool. In a world of scarcity, we treasure tools. In a world of abundance, we treasure taste. The barriers to entry are low, competition is fierce, and so much of the focus has shifted. From tech to distribution, and now to something else. Taste.
Today, I'm going to be going through this. What is taste? Let's start with what the 101 is, right? What is taste? Why do you need it? What it is, I'm going to put it in some very simple terms. When you have unlimited number of options out there, how do you narrow down on something specific? Let's say you have a party coming up and you have a certain dress code, or you want to wear something cool to this party. Number one, why is wearing something to this party even important, right? You've got this on Saturday. Why can't I just wear whatever the hell I want, what I wear on a regular Saturday, and go there? Because as humans, we want to communicate something about ourselves when we're in social situations. You might go to a party and there are 30 people there. Very likely you're not going to be able to talk to 30 people. Let's just say there are a certain group of people you will speak to, but then there's a bunch of people who will see you there, and like maybe you will meet them later. And even though you might not be able to talk to them, you want to communicate something about yourself, right? That's typically how it goes. Now, that's just a simple example I'm giving you, right? Which is humans, we're very social creatures. And when you put us in social settings, there is a lot of communication and sub communication that happens. You're speaking to people, but at the same time, your body language is saying something about you. The intonation of your voice is saying something about you, right? If you are wearing a certain brand, that's saying something about you, right? Taste, to put it in very simple terms, coming to this slide here, I liked this example. Let's say you're cooking, you're a chef. In order to make delicious food, you must eat delicious food, right? If you are a chef, you're cooking for someone, hopefully you are somebody who's a foodie, right? There's this thing they say, which is never trust a skinny chef, right? It's a kind of a saying. But overall, this is the point right here. If you are in this position where you are serving food to people, and now serving food, it's a very specific example I'm taking, right? The general example and general normal person example I gave was something like dressing. Guys, I'll be very upfront, right? When I was maybe 11 or 12, I didn't have a dressing sense or something. Like I didn't even know that was a thing. I want you to remember this, okay? I want you to just think about this. Growing up, at some point, you realize that, yo, what I wear is important, right? And at some point, you started buying your own clothes rather than your parents buying clothes for you. And suddenly, you had to figure out, what do I buy? A core fundamental where a lot of this begins is growing up, we have certain influences. One influence for me, for example, I remember the first time I bought my first Nike t-shirt. Right? Nike back then was really expensive as a brand. And I didn't have any Nikes, and I couldn't really ask my parents to buy me Nike. But then at the same time, I knew that the cool kids that I would hang out with, they wore Nikes. And I was like, yo, that's a cool t-shirt. I liked the design, you could say. But also, I kind of liked the brand. Like, it was cool. It was interesting. It kind of was a conversation point, right? A lot of taste, like it or not, actually happens growing up, right? Your preferences, number one. What do you like? What do you not like? Maybe there's a very simple reason. But for me, for example, a lot of my friends were into football. And so I really wanted a Nike t-shirt, but very specifically, I got a Manchester United Nike tee. Right? It wasn't a jersey. Those were like crazy expensive. Why? Because I watched football too, and my friends and I, we would talk about it, and kind of became a shared reference between us. A lot of what taste comes down to is firstly leaning into what your references are, what your likes and dislikes are, what are your preferences. Why did I buy a Manchester United t-shirt over Chelsea? But then what this creates, your preferences and references, it creates shared culture, which is you, groups of people, but then also you, or let's say me in this case, being in Bangalore and connecting to the Manchester United fandom or the scene that was global. This culture here could just be the culture of India and cricket and sports in India, right? So cricket. And there are some shared rituals that we do around, which is watching these matches. There's a certain shared culture, and we bond with other people over these things. And so when you get an artifact like a t-shirt, It makes you feel connected. But what it also does is it reinforces your identity. I am a cricket fan and I'm representing India when I wear this hoodie. Not on the stage, but at least in my subgroup. Or I'm a Manchester United fan. Like, let's say you, whatever team. I'm honestly, I don't watch football. Right? I was a Man U fan at some point because it was cool, but I just don't. I just stopped watching. But it's a shared thing, right? You guys are getting that? Now, where does taste come in? Let's come back to this iPad thing. A very simple way to think about it. What is it? Is taste is something which is very personal, number one. It's your inclination or your preferences for certain things. Why does it matter? The world we live in today, humans, socially, we have a certain culture, and having a certain taste, is kind of representative of your identity. Like this food example here, like let's just, who's the top food in the food space that comes? Let's say Anthony Bourdain. Anthony Bourdain was traveling like crazy, going and experiencing these local cultures, and these were his reference points. His reference points were, this is this banh mi that you can get in Vietnam, and they would do it a certain way. And it's so special when they do it that way, and it tastes really good. And there is some culture around that. So the artifact here might just be a sandwich, right? A banh mi. Anthony Bourdain is just this person who's going and discovering this, but he's got a taste for it. What happens here? Developing taste, usually, as you're exposed to more things in life, or you observe certain things, you observe the people who have certain tastes. These observations, they stack up, right? And talking from a purely professional perspective, in the same way you would not trust a skinny chef. If you're a designer and a client is hiring you, they expect you to have good taste, and being very specific, they expect you to have better taste than them. Think about that for a sec, right? If I'm hiring somebody and I have to tell you what looks good, bro, shouldn't you know how things look? Like, shouldn't you know what good is? For example, if I get a chef, right? I'm going to that chef's restaurant and the food is bad, and the chef supposed to care, right? They're supposed to care about it, because in the end, what you cook has to be used, has to be eaten by the person on the other end. Otherwise, it's not so good. So there is a connection between the person who creates and the person who consumes, right? And it's closely linked. Why does it matter? Now, from a psychological perspective, taste is about expressing yourself in a lot of cases, right? We talked about some of these psychological, practical reasons. But from a professional perspective, taste is how you show that you are a nerd about something. For example, let's say I'm doing website design. The client expects me to know what the trends are. They expect me to know, number one, what the universal principles, what's considered good, not subjective, objectively what's considered good, right? That's where it begins, right? So good taste, it kind of starts with some universal principles. So for example, what are the universal principles of design? I'll list a few of them, okay? Balance, hierarchy. These are some core universal principles, right? If your design looks bad, you can look at these principles and you can probably be able to troubleshoot. White space, proximity, rhythm or repetition, emphasis. So, for example, contrast, something stands out, consistency. The very first bar, the first barrier to cross is above a layman. A layman might be able to look at something and say, this looks good, or they might not be able to share an opinion at all, right? They're like, theek hi to hai. You open a certain app or open a certain website, they're gonna just read it. They're not gonna notice. In the same way that, let's say you might be in a group of people and some people are going to be looking downward. They're going to be looking at what shoes you're wearing, right? Because that's another way we signal. Everybody wears shoes. The thing we were talking about also, there's certain minimum qualification they need to have to be a good shoe, a decent shoe. Otherwise, you're gonna be like, yo, I've been swindled. Like these shoes, they broke after the first time. But what happens beyond that is design. What happens beyond that is your taste. And a consumer is going to look at those shoes and they're going to feel a certain way. Firstly, there's going to be a certain perception based on how good the photo shoot is. Let's say you're going to feel a certain way. You're going to be like, wow, these shoes feel premium. That perception, it might create desire. Like, I want this. It might evoke an emotion. So, for example, let's say something like Nikes. I kind of have the soft spot for Nike because growing up, I really had to beg my parents to buy me Nike shoes. And they were like, why should we buy you branded shoes versus not branded, right? And so a lot of that started there. But I have a certain emotion associated with it. Storytelling, or the story you might tell, can also influence. So, for example, this Gully Labs example, they have the story about Indian hockey and something around the aesthetics of Indian hockey and all of this stuff. Now, that's storytelling, right? They're doing it through the medium of photography and maybe videos. They're making reels about it. So, anyway, the reason I say all this is, as a consumer, we are subjected to this every single day, right? There are certain universal principles, which is things need to be, they need to work really well, they need to look good, they need to be good functional products. And there are certain universal principles for every whatever you're designing. But then beyond that, as a creator, you need to be able to create a certain perception. You need to, if there is an emotion you can tap into. So, for example, nostalgia. Nostalgia is a hell of a drug, right? A strong emotion. You could tap into that emotion with a story. Jaipur Watch House, right? Interesting brand. I've seen their Insta. They have watches and they have really cool stories behind it, right? So, for example, I think if you're talking about the same brand, they have this thing where they have a watch that has like an Indian coin or something in it. And it's like they're connecting it to the heritage of India, like something like that, right? But point is, personally for me, I saw it and I was like, yeah, that's cool. I like collecting coins, so I might get it, right? In fact, it kind of goes to childhood. I used to collect coins as a kid. So for me, it really has this emotion of, yo, that's cool. But then depending on the story, I might make a purchase or not. A lot of it comes down to aesthetics, right? Once, if you're selling coffee, of course, you better make good coffee. You can't sell bad coffee because then your business is going to go down the minute people realize it's not good. But beyond that, once everybody has coffee, right, there is also this idea of a commodity. For example, coffee is kind of a commodity, right? The raw materials you're making to make coffee is, everybody has access to it, right? Which makes it a commodity. Yet the perception, the emotion, the storytelling, maybe the interior design of the place, right? Maybe the unique design or the way you've made it your special point, like your USP. What's specific about this? That's what maybe makes it special, and people resonate with it. There are things that are trends, right? So trend is kind of when it becomes a thing. Web design, for example, glass morphism, that's a trend. Linear stripe trend. How many of you guys have seen this? There's this classic Ira quote around the gap. People who get into creative work, we have a good taste. So, as you are exposed to more stuff, right? Whether you're a chef going and eating different foods, or you're a designer, you're checking out different sites, it's core you immerse yourself. You would probably consciously or subconsciously make certain observations about it. Bento box grids. Yeah, it's a popular trend. Neopop using retro pixels, Frutiger Aero, linear or stripe brand, like flat design. Now, these are trends, right? Personally, I would say you should try to be aware of what these trends are, because a lot of times clients don't realize it, but they are very, very influenced by what the trend is, because they are consumers first, right? A lot of times. Clients sometimes really want trends, because trends, being up to date with trends, is how you signal that you are relevant. Trends are important for that reason. Knowing that something is a trend immediately puts you in the in group somewhat, right? Because you know it's a trend. How do you know it? You've seen it enough times that you recognize it and you start spotting it everywhere. And then you're like, okay, that's a trend. Let's say reels, right? On reels, there's a certain style, the certain editing style where it's the chill guy aesthetic, but it's like these edits with like inspirational sounding music and like fake motivational edits, right? Now that's a trend. It's popular right now. If a client is hiring you as a video editor to make some video, some marketing video, usually the goal is they want to stand out. And if they do something that is on trend, it's likely that it gets picked up, right? Because the people who've been exposed to that now kind of start wanting more, or sometimes it's just the algorithm. The algorithm suggests more, right? So people might not say, I like this trend, but if the algorithm feels like you are now browsing a lot of this, they will recommend more, right? And so more shows up. So a lot of our taste making today happens via algorithms. However, the thing to remember is there is this idea of the personal versus the collective. A trend, you might really resonate with that because it evokes a certain emotion, or just you're just used to it. There's this thing of personal versus collective, right? Something like this, it's a collective trend. We're all going through this together. But something to realize is you can have your own preferences, right? And a lot of taste, I want you to understand, you don't want to just consume, right? Taste is a thing that you inculcate. A quote that I really liked was, taste is the personalizing of culture, which is, you have infinite possibilities. We live in this algorithmic time, but for you to find something that resonates with yourself, you are taking this thing and you're kind of personalizing it, right? It's your reference. The question I wanted to answer, how do you develop taste? Definitely, you need to be exposing yourself to a lot more stuff. Like, for example, if you wanted to become a food blogger, let's just say you want to make reels about awesome food in your city, you clearly have to have an interest for food. Number two, people probably ask you for recommendation, right? So you're known as the person in the friend group who gives the most bomb food recommendations. But the reason why is because you've tried so much stuff that your opinion carries weight, right? But it's happened through iterations. So similarly, what I will say is, developing taste is about exposure. Be exposed to good resources, right? Like literally infinite rabbit holes on the internet. Your job to explore them though. They're not going to reveal themselves to you unless the algorithm pushes something up. In that case, yeah. But really, it is this kind of iceberg, right? Like we only, a lot of us, only see what the algorithm shows us, but there's a lot of stuff usually below this iceberg. Building taste, it's also about practice, it's also about iteration. But guys, core human motivation, something that's very core to us humans, is figuring out how are we different, right? So a lot of taste, it's not this optional thing that we do. It's really to figure out who we are. And it maybe a little bit sometimes feel dystopian because it's so closely tied to brand and consumerism and like human psychology and using it to sell more stuff by creating a certain aesthetic. But really, guys, taste is really how we express ourselves. Me, if I feel like I am one among, like NPC, right? If I feel like I'm NPC, like one among millions and millions of people, that's an identity crisis. You guys know what an identity crisis, right? When we become teenagers, we realize, fuck, who am I, bro? Like, who am I? Like, we all go through this experience, which is like our identities form. And then our identities either confirmed, which is we see something and our friends also have a similar thing. So we feel like we're connected. But then sometimes our identities are confronted. We're like, am I really this kind of person? Right? So taste is the personalizing of culture. Culture is this thing that hangs all around us. Taste is how we personalize it, how we kind of form our identities. This banger article by somebody in Silicon Valley named Anu, and she wrote this article called Taste is Eating Silicon Valley. The idea is, as markets get more competitive, you have to differentiate in some way, right? Like we were talking about shoes earlier. If there's a lot of shoe brands, there's Nike, Adidas, Puma, Lotto, Bata. How do you decide? When you have options, how do you decide? That decision that you take when you have a lot of options, that's a little bit you exercising your taste. Now, you might just go with Nike because you've heard about the brand. You might do it because your friends wear Nike and so you want to do it. Or you might be, fuck it, counter signal, right? So you might do signal, which is, oh, I like Nike and so I want to wear this. But then you might counter signal like, fuck Nike, bro. Jordans are so NPC. I'm going to wear Yeezys. And then you're counter signaling to a different subgroup. But anyway, that's happening to software, right? That's the thesis in this article. The products we use, we spend a lot of time on these, on these platforms. And so clearly they influence, the way they are, it influences our behavior, our beliefs. Now, over time, at least the thesis of this article is, when you want to stand out, right? Let's say with AI, it's getting easier to build apps. Now, what's going to be your moat? In the past, building apps was difficult as fuck, right? You needed to have developers who are really skilled and you need to combine a team that costs you a lot of money. You to pay their salaries and then they make an app for you. So the differentiator or the moat was money to some extent, and then it was skill. Now, let's say with AI, it's easier to make apps, or everybody has software developers now. The moat shifted to distribution, which is, okay, I can create a new Facebook, but who the hell is going to use it, right? Facebook has unique, or Instagram has unique network effects that it's their distribution. Beyond that, when it's easy to create, when distribution is no longer a moat, right? Or let's say with something like content creation, like you can now, the costs of creating, let's say, an anime have gone down. You could use these AI tools theoretically. You'll still have to exercise your taste, right? Like somebody who's not a nerd about anime, they might use these AI tools to make something, probably not going to be good. But somebody who's a nerd about anime and knows all the references and knows the cool art styles and which anime is the best, which directors are the best, they might be able to create better prompts and create better outputs, right? So taste becomes a differentiator once everybody has tools. Similarly, and that's not just AI, right? Let's say something like Photoshop. You guys know in India, there are these, coaching center type of things where they teach you 10 tools. They'll be like Blender, Maya, 3D, Photoshop. But clearly, somebody who knows Photoshop, that's the tool. But creating something, you need to have taste. So what they do is they make you go through a bunch of references as well, right? They say, what are these trends? And then you use the tool to kind of replicate these trends. Why? It's because you're practicing and you're also absorbing a lot more. Taste is not something that is built passively. It's active involvement, right? So taking that example earlier of food, you can't just passively make an opinion about food. You need to go out there and eat. You need to make observations. You need to make judgments. Those of you who watch Mad Men, season 6, there's one episode where they're in a client meeting, and I think it's Don and Peggy and a bunch of other folks, and they have two options, right? And so the two creative directors, Ted Chaw and Don Draper, they're like, we want to pick, and this is for a women's brand, and so Peggy walks in and they ask her for her opinion. Which of these should we go with? And you know what she says? She says they're both good. And they both get pissed off. Both these creative directors, they get pissed off at her. Now, from Peggy's perspective, what she was trying to say is, if I take your side, I am siding with you. And then so I'm going to clash with this other person. And so I'm going to take the safe option of just saying they're both good. But later in the thing, when Dawn is alone with Peggy and he's like, what the hell was that? As a creative, you are paid to have an opinion. You can't say it's all good. You can't say chalta hai. No. You have to have taste and you have to exercise that taste, right? You need to have an opinion. It's very easy for us to have opinions, right? But a lot of times we're afraid to express it, especially in professional settings, right? For example, you're like, oh, I want to tell my boss this is good, but they're not going to agree with it, or they just don't get it. And so sometimes creatives create this us versus them scenario where it's like them on one side, oh, creative people, we get it, bro. We get it. We're so cool. Bosses, they don't know what the fuck is going on. They're like, make it pop. They're like, maza aana chahiye, feel nahi aa rahi. Honestly, though, these guys are paying you the money. Why? Because you have good taste. You're supposed to have an opinion, but also you're supposed to have an understanding of when to follow the trend, signaling, when to reject the trend, counter signaling, right? So, for example, if something is a trend, as a brand, you have the option to counter signal that trend and go opposite, right? And that will attract equal group of people. But as a creative, need to have a strong opinion. Any opinion at all, you need to have gone through enough iterations. You need to have tried enough stuff to be able to give an informed opinion, right? So let me take a little bit more technical example. Client scenario. You're a designer on Academy, you're designing some feature, and now you have to decide, okay? One option, it's a course page. One option is you have sections. So about, schedule, something, and it's a scroll. And users have to scroll through this to see the information. And at the end, they have FAQs and you can buy it. The other option, this is an iteration you made, is we have this, but we put it in tabs instead, right? So instead of scrolling to see the information, you have to switch tabs. This is a very common kind of decision you might be faced with, right? Let's say you're designing an e-commerce website. Now, should you just put everything as one long scroll, all the benefits, oh, this has this cotton, it's made of this material, you can do this with it, it's waterproof, this, that. Should you put it all into a long scroll, or should you break this up into tabs? So about, material, information. Now, obviously, there's not just two ways of doing this, right? When we're designing these information systems, right, talking core UX here, what we have to figure out is what the user's motivations here are. But then what's the goal of the system? The goal of the system is to get you to buy in this case. Now, if you have to decide between this, now it might be hard to realize like where does taste come in? It's not like I'm being like this is cool and this is not cool, right? So taste is not always about status and identity. Here, you would first weigh the functionality of two. Now, from a functional perspective, the scroll increases the length of the page. Here, the information there it's put sideways, right? So they're tabs. However, as an expert, you might also know this, right, through experience, or maybe you've been taught this in the cohort or whatever. Most of the times people don't go through these tabs, right? So you might have 100% of people landing on first tab, and then 60% of them will click the second tab, and then 30% will click the third tab. And so whatever's in the later tabs won't get read. You might also realize, hey, I saw this other example where somebody combined these two approaches. So they took the best of both. So most e-commerce sites are just a scroll. You keep scrolling, and that's how you discover information. And maybe there's a sticky call to action, right? So the button is not all the way at the bottom, it's always sticking to the bottom of the screen. Visualize, guys. I'm really trying to build your visualization power, right? But then if somebody wants to jump to the second section, you can also have tabs here that auto scroll. And instead of putting the information in tabs like this, you put the tabs like this, but clicking on it scrolls you in position. Now, how do you decide? You weigh the two options against each other. The personal thing here, it's not so much about my personal preference or my taste. This is cool, that's cool. It's also my domain expertise in the back. So I'm going to say, hey, in the last project, we tried that and it did not perform so well. Or you might point to the industry. So the industry trend. So let's now do a comparative research. Let's go see, very classic cliche at this point is how does Airbnb do it? So again, we don't want to copy Airbnb because that would be just copying the trend, but we want to make a proper analysis of what is an industry leader, how do they do it. So maybe that creates one benchmark that we can compare against, and then you might say 2 3 others. So how do e-commerce sites do it, how do travel sites do it, how do whatever's closest to your domain, and then in the end you will make a decision. Some people they just be like, hey, let's A/B test this. A little bit why A/B testing has a little bit of a bad rep. Number one, because you need to have a lot of users to A/B test to get statistical significance. But other than that, A/B test is a lazy way of saying I don't want to decide. Let's just push both. It's not having an opinion, right? Honestly, A/B test it's not the way to go, right? Like if I'm getting 1,000 users on my site and I show both of these, firstly I have to develop both of these, but then it might not be statistically significant. Let's say 60% people do this, but then when 10,000 users scales to 100,000 users, that behavior might not persist, right? What we were talking about is there is subjectivity sometimes because people might not understand or align with certain stuff, right? So there is something like a taste alignment. But in the end, clients do care about taste from this perspective. They want you to have good design. They want you to tell them what's good. But also, this is kind of where we have to adjust our expectations, like get feedback, not take it. Taste can sometimes be very closely tied to identity. So if you've heard this thing of, oh, bro, creative people are assholes, a lot of times it's because creative people might sometimes feel challenged, right? When somebody says that's not good, because they kind of take it as a threat to their identity. Like, bro, how did you say that to me? Mujhe kaise bol diya, right? Anyways, one thing I will also plug is we are working on something. We just released this. It's bxmuseum.com. Now, guys, it's not like I'm gatekeeping this or something, but we've not really made a huge scene about this, right? This is still pretty low key. Most people don't know we actually launched this. But what it is it's a huge repository of artifacts. You know how we were talking about this idea that a lot of taste is about your preferences, but then your preferences are shaped by culture. And usually the way you interact with culture is through objects, right? And so, I mean, you can think about it from that way. The other way you can think about it is if you are exploring brands, you're designing brands, and if you're mood boarding for something, a lot of these are just rare references for you, right? And we've tastefully, which is with a lot of effort and curation, put these together for you. So, for example, if you want to check out, like, let me show you something cool, okay? Let's look at Air India. Now, guys, we have 68 artifacts from Air India. But just to give you a visual, check this out, right? We've kind of curated these nostalgic, you could say, but it's really rare resources. For example, Air India used to have a lot of these city based campaigns. A lot of these would go so hard today, right? This is, even though this was made years ago, decades ago, so relevant, this style. I don't know. Some rare resources as well, like, for example, did you know there was something called the Maharaja class, which was even better than first class? So a lot of windows had this Indian style. You can see this ornamentation on top, this thing here. But yeah, this is the Maharaja class pictures, the first class executive cabin. Got this. Now we're getting into current Air India. But yeah, anyway, something interesting. We've created some categories as well if you want to browse. So we've got, so here on filters, you can, for example, see lifestyle brands. We only have one or what? For example, F&B, we've got some, anyway, work in progress. We've added a bunch of brands here. Check this out, okay? And the other thing I will say is I want you to go download the BX cheat sheet. So we also actually put together a free resource that you can go just enter your email. We'll just send it to you. We'll send you a PDF. It's like it's got resources basically, right? If you want to just enhance your creative aura, but honestly, it's just a bunch of resources to help you go deep into the fundamentals. So things like typography, storytelling, narrative, you can check it out here.